Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for being here. My name is Jason Grotto. I'm a current Nieman Fellow and a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. I have had the great privilege of working with everyone on this stage here, and I can tell you that sitting before you now are some of the best investigative and writing talent in the country. I'm just really, I feel very honored to be here and to know you guys. We have our format today is going to be, we're going to ask each team to ask the other a question. And for those of you who don't know, Dave and Carol and Audra and I worked at the Chicago Tribune together. So there's many overlaps here. So I think this is going to be kind of fun. So I thought we would do is I'd start with you guys. If you could, if Miami Herald team could ask the Chicago Tribune team a question about their series.
So what do you think Rahm Emanuel would say if he were sitting here right now and learned that you just got an award for fairness?
No expletives. No swear words.
It's hard to speculate. My guess would be he would be a little surprised and a little bit put back. But secretly, I think he would never admit this, but I think he likes me a little bit because
Everybody likes
we're both known for being colossal jerks when we're fed a line of bull. It's interesting. I think the whole subject of fairness and the definition of that word it is evolving all the time, especially now in an atmosphere where newspaper journalists are being required to work on a 24-hour news cycle, and things are being pushed into the paper so quickly, and it is very, very easy, and a lot of politicians expect us to spew whatever they say, whether it be propaganda or an outright lie or anything, into the newspaper, and that's their view of fairness. And a lot of times, lies and propaganda do get elevated in the name of fairness. But for me, this story, maybe more than any other story that I've ever worked on, was about fairness to the people who read the newspaper, above all. And as much as we tried, I mean, there was an example when we first got this data, and Alex first did we call them EKGs. We had a spike. We had a picture of every camera, and it looked like a heartbeat, and you could see, and the things would go off the charts. The very first thing we did was we put the 24 worst ones together in a pile, and we gave them to the city and said, please tell us what's going on here. We didn't lurk. We didn't try to hide what we were doing. And because we thought, well, shoot, maybe somebody moved a traffic cone that day, or maybe there was some change in traffic patterns. Maybe there's some legitimate explanation. And when a week went by and they called us and said, we've never seen this. We have no idea. That's when we thought, whoa. And so we gave them 6 months. Well, we were trying to find the answers ourselves. We gave them 6 months before we published that story to come up with an answer. I don't know how you can be any more fair than that. And to this day, they still can't answer a lot of those reasons.
Dave, Alex, do you guys have a question for the?
Yeah, Carol, we've known each other for 20 years, and you have been dogged on the issue of child abuse and the state's failures in that regard ever since I've known you. But you have always been kind of a lone wolf, and this seems like the first time that I can imagine where they've teamed you up with a narrative storyteller, and I'm just curious what challenges that presented and how often you guys were at each other's throat and how difficult it was to let go of these stories.
The truth of it is that I fought long and hard to get Audra on the team. The minute that we decided to do this series, I said she was the first person I wanted to work with. And there were several reasons for that. The most selfless reason was it elevated the journalism tremendously. And I knew that if we were going to write stories about hundreds of children who were abused and neglected and died, the writing had to be crisp, it had to be compelling, it had to draw you in, it had to chafe your emotions, and there was no one in the room who could do that better than Audra could. From a selfish point of view, I wanted to work with her. I wanted to learn what she did to write better, you know, how you conduct an interview to get the telling details you need to write a beautiful story. To me anyway, I thought it made perfect sense. And then of course we learned later that people were looking at us and saying, well, that's an odd pairing. Why did they do that? But I think the results speak for themselves. And you know, one of the things that I hear with some regularity was that the writing of this thing stood out, and that was one of the things that made it effective. And having her absolute gift for telling a story was one of the things that elevated this series.
How many times did you want to wring her neck?
Never.
And the flip
I
side,
think he was talking to Audra.
I was ignoring that. The flip side, though, is that here was a project that, under normal circumstances, I would not have been considered for because, you know, I had been on the Metro desk, but I had moved over to features and then sort of bounced back and was writing Enterprise. But, you know, I would not have been the first person they chose for an investigative project. And so pairing us allowed us to learn from each other. There are things that, you know, that I learned from her about, you know, about investigations that I had not known before. So when we married the two, and of course there was some give and take, and lots of Subway. That helps. Subway sandwiches make everything okay. But the whole, I do think that when you put two people together and you blend their skill sets, it really can be a really good thing.
That's great. You know, one of the things that I'm reminded of, because I worked for both the Chicago Tribune, which just a few years ago emerged from bankruptcy, and the Miami Herald, which I was in Miami a couple of months ago and was sad to see that the building there on the bay has been torn down. Both newsrooms have been cut significantly over the last decade. And yet, you have been able to do this incredible work, and it just fills those of us in the trenches with hope and put some fire in the belly. So I wanted to ask you both, maybe we'll start with you guys. What was the process of getting the kinds of, you both got resources, tremendous amount of resources to do these stories. So for everyone who says that newspapers are on their way out, we obviously still get some resources to do this kind of work. Can you talk a little bit about the sales pitch, or did you have a struggle to get these stories out there? And maybe we could start with you, Dave.
They probably had a little bit more of a struggle because theirs was going to be a deep dive from the very beginning. Mine was a kind of rolled out. I had no idea when I started this. I'm not the red light camera guy, right? I don't want to be the red light. I'm an investigative reporter. I'm a political investigative reporter. I cover Rahm. And so this sort of rolled out for me gradually. But I got to tell you something. As soon as we got the internal company records that suggested that there might be some corruption there, you know, I am fortunate enough to work for a newspaper that recognizes that its bread and butter is the things that nobody else can do. This was a story that wasn't going to get told without us, and they knew that the red light cameras are unpopular just on their face, and they also knew that that Rahm's idea to expand into speed cameras was not very popular. And so I started rolling these stories out gradually, and they saw the clicks and they saw the hits, and it sort of just it sort of snowballed all on its own. I will say that the Tribune did something that I have never seen a newspaper do, and that is we went to them late in the process last year and said, look, you know, the city's got all these safety claims. We don't believe them. We've looked at this data. we've done what we can do as journalists with the help of experts to debunk this stuff. But at the end of the day, it's just the Tribune against the city. We need to spend some money and do an actual study. It's never been done on red light cameras. And to their credit, the Chicago Tribune, which is as strapped as any newspaper in the country for money, wrote the check. We sort of acted as the foot soldiers on that, and they handed all this data over to some traffic experts, and they did an actual study that completely put the lie to everything the city had been saying about the safety effectiveness of these cameras. And in fact, what the study showed was at about half the cameras, not only was there not any safety benefits, it probably made things more dangerous because these cameras prompt an increase in rear-end crashes because people, they see the camera there, they got a short yellow light, and they slam on the brakes faster instead of just taking their chance with the yellow. And so where there is no benefit on right-angle crashes, and there's an increase in rear-end crashes caused by the cameras, at about half the intersections, that's the case. And it's interesting to point out that after $500 million in revenue, it took the Chicago Tribune to do the first actual study of what these cameras were really doing. They didn't spend one dime to do any kind of actual science on the effectiveness of those cameras.
Unbelievable. I want to switch up this question a little bit for you guys because, Carol, you had mentioned in your speech that the Miami Herald was one of the few papers that continues to cover family services on a state level. I would just say, having worked with you, you're a big reason why they do that. You're a tenacious reporter. In fact, Dave and I worked on a series about neglect and deaths in DCF with you at the Miami Herald. So I wanted to, in terms of your guys' investigation, which lasted 3 years, at least 1.5 years of very intense reporting, a lot of times when you're a reporter, especially an investigative reporter, and you go and pitch a story, one of the first things that the editors will ask you is, has it been done before? This is a case where you've been hammering these guys for years and years and years. So I know this was an egregious case, but we've seen some very egregious cases in Florida before. What was it that you did, or how was it that this came together that you were able to sell the story to the editors and get Audrey on board and all of the resources that you were able to muster for this story?
Oddly, looking back, I don't recall there being a tremendous fight. There were some developments at the Herald that coincided with the launch of this series. One of them was that I was shifting over from beat reporter to full-time investigative reporter anyway, and it seemed like the perfect story to launch as my first dive, having started this new job. And it is true that we've written this story again and again and again and again, but it never gained any traction. There was a point in our conversations where we were looking at some of the stories we'd done in the past and some of the stories that we sort of turned out before publication as chum. We released a handful of stories that year right before publication just to let people know that we were there and that this was an issue we were very interested in. And those stories also were very successful. Even before the series was published, the Secretary of the Department of Children and Families lost his job because we were out there and we had found a cluster of deaths about 6 months before publication that was very troubling. Once we had made the commitment to do the series, almost everything that we asked for, we got. And Audra and I both have said repeatedly how grateful we are to the Miami Herald for committing resources, time, skill players at every position to help us. And that really was the difference. We had a terrific young man named Lázaro Gamio who helped us put together the database. The page designers were wonderful and did tremendous work. And pretty much Emily Michaud, our videographer. If you haven't seen the videos, do yourself a favor. Please go and look at them. They're tremendous. Once the Herald made the commitment, they never flinched. And that was a godsend to us because there was just so much that went into trying to put together a quality product. There were trips that both of us took across the state, the length and breadth of the state, with the videographer. We took an intern on my trip because she had done a lot of terrible, just real grunt work, and we felt she'd earned it. Surprisingly, especially given the state of the Miami, we just laid off 6 people a week ago. And yet, when it came to this series and another one that a colleague of ours did this year, they didn't flinch.
I will also add that it was a Friday night, and it was late at night. We had been working very late, and we had been counting. We had the database, but we also were counting these files manually. We had a total of something like 700 files that we were, bringing down to the number that was going to meet our criteria. And there was this moment in the middle of that Friday night when we realized that we were only halfway done, that we had maybe 250, and we had double to go. And we went into that office and said, we're not going to make deadline, and we need help. And they gave it to us. And I believe that was on the strength of Carol's reporting, of her history, of the series, the other series that she had done in the past. And our commitment to them was, if you give us the help, we'll deliver. But we couldn't do it by ourselves, and they did it. They gave us extra people, extra time, and it was a commitment that, like you said, we're terribly grateful for. I don't know that we could do this again, but for sure they did it. They were awesome in terms of the support they gave us for this project.
I think there's a good newspapers. There's a strategy here overall, and like I said before, I mean we can't compete on the internet. Just can't do it. We're not going to compete with Yahoo and celebrity news and clickbaits. The only thing, and I would agree with the strategy, the winning strategy, if there is a one, for newspapers is watchdog journalism. And so I think smart newspapers, even as they're maybe cutting back other places, maybe even as they are very sadly decimating the beat system, which in my view leads to a lot of watchdog journalism, they are investing in the kind of journalism that Carol and Alex and Audra and I do, and that is the sort of the long form, take a really deep dive at something that nobody else is looking at.
Yeah. One of the things that I think we all know has been driving some of this investigative work is the use of data. And Dave and Alex, your series in particular was an intense amount of analysis. And Alex, I wonder if you could just, without getting too far into the weeds, if you could tell us a little bit about what the issues that you faced were. I'm having done a lot of analysis myself. It's a very dangerous thing. There's a lot of mistakes that you can make. So can you let us a little bit into the world of what you were trying to do, proving that these cameras weren't safe and manipulating the data and dealing with it on that level?
Yeah, sure. This is usually the part where everyone's eyes glaze over. I'll try not to have that happen. So in this case, we had a legal fight for this data. We had to challenge the city, and that was a whole process in itself. When we finally got this information, I sort of approached it the way I think I approach most data reporting things, especially in an investigative setting. There's something wrong with this data. What's the matter with it? What is going to totally derail us and blow us out of the water in an attempt to get a story in the newspaper? In this case, I think the flaw that we saw when we started digging through this information was just that there were these wild outliers in the data. And I think sometimes you're looking at electronic records to capture the trends, and in this case, it was the outliers that we were looking for that really made the story. On the analysis front, I mean, that's more or less like a counting task, right? We had rows and columns of individual red light camera tickets. We had a time, we had a license plate number, and we had the ultimate disposition of the ticket. I mean, that's in itself is a pretty simplistic task of trying to, turn that into something aggregated to look at and sort of gauge, what's high, what's low. The real challenge I think we had was figuring out how to really approach the safety question. Crash statistics, it's a really complex statistical game that's far above anything I know how to do because they're sort of randomly dispersed events. And so we had to spend some time finding and talking to experts who really understood how to make comparisons of red light intersections and non-red light intersections, a real apples to apples thing, so we could actually gauge what kind of trends were happening in terms of safety. And it was just a sort of an arduous process.
Anybody has any time later, we were happy to go into the science of the empirical Bayes method of scientific analysis.
Well, I actually remember, Alex, talking to you about the analysis and you wringing your hands and worried about how are you going to figure this out. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of what I call gurus or rabbis in your move to try to understand data and leaning on experts to help you. What was the process like to find the people that you eventually did to do the analysis?
We were calling experts to check on the experts. So it was right. We were doubling down everywhere and sending the results of one study to the end. So we but at the end of the day, we were solid.
Right, but I think the big value in first, shopping around our results to experts was that when we finally put all of this work in front of the city, sort of after we had gone through the process of having it, gone over and analyzed by these folks in Texas, was that, we went in there and when we went in there to talk to the city at the very end of the process before that story went in the paper, there was no question that these results were correct. And surprisingly enough, we got in the room with Rebecca Scheinfeld, the transportation commissioner, and even she was like, yep, your study, pretty solid, it's all right.
It's called bulletproof.
Yeah.
Bulletproofing, yeah.
It's also important to point out that the data analysis, very complex, lots of data, and after we got the EKGs, all we had was a picture and what looked like an anomaly, and we had to go out and obtain identities from tag numbers. We had to go interview, and we literally looked at thousands we went online, put our tag number in and our ticket number, and looked at videos with thousands of tickets. What's going on out there? And we were able, through that process, we would call people. Was there a basketball game at the United Center? What was going on out there? Were you diverted because of traffic somewhere? And we were able to ascertain the reasons in a lot of cases. For one in particular, the tickets, the data that we had didn't say what the infraction was. So we didn't know whether people were blowing straight through the light or whether they were rolling through a right turn on red. We didn't know without actually going and looking at the violation in the video and everything. And we were able to determine in some of these cases where the spike was the result of a complete change. All the tickets prior to the spike were for blowing straight through on a yellow. And during the spike, hundreds and hundreds of tickets over a 12-day period, all of them were for right turns on red only, and then right back the other way. So they were flipping the switch on what was being enforced out there from day to day to day.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. Audra, I wanted to ask you, you're normally, as you said, a features writer, and you've had a incredible career at the Miami Herald doing features. Suddenly you're thrown in with Carol, and you're tasked with helping write an investigative story. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about, in terms of your approach to the writing, to the narrative structure of the story, how it was different from you. Were there any struggles that you had in terms of capturing that sort of investigative feel?
Yeah. Fortunately, I'd had a little bit of a transition because I had moved over to Metro before Carol and I started working together, and I was covering veteran issues, which was a little newsier than some of the things I had covered in the past. So I was already sort of pointed towards news. But there were great challenges because first of all, I write long, long, and long. And so, there were many conversations about having to tell these stories and how, we want to tell them in a very powerful and moving way, but not, in a long form sort of story. So that was the first thing that I had to acquire, a different kind of discipline that I had not either had before or had to employ before. The second thing is having to take, what you've done, the storytelling, which is something that is sort of natural for me, and combine it with these facts and weaving those things together, into something that's very cohesive and coherent. And I think one of the things that worked for Carol and I is we use sort of a draft system. So I would write part of it, she would write part of it, and then we would, sometimes we would blend individually, and then sometimes we would sit and do it together. And so, there were many times where we would come upon, a paragraph or two where we really needed to sort of make a decision on what direction do we need to go with in terms of the tone of a particular kind of the information we wanted to impart. Was it the piece where we wanted to move the people, or was it the piece where we're trying to, not really trying, but wanting to outrage, and how to marry those two kinds of things, facts that, sort of, we once call it the heart and the head, and blending them, in a way that was going to be, that was going to offer our readers some clarity as to what we needed to say. And oftentimes what we found, there were a couple of instances where we found where it was just straight storytelling. When we wrote the story about the snake, this is a story about a little girl who is strangled by a Burmese python in her bed while her parents are allegedly sleeping off a high. And that was the kind of story where, we didn't have to load it up with any data. You just tell that story. And then there were others that we really needed to really drill down on the policy, because the policy was how we got here, And so we did a lot of back and forth with that, and I think in the end, learned a lot from each other about how to approach stories. I think both of us are better at what we do now after this project.
That's great.
Individually,
Yeah. So I wanted to open it up to the audience. We'll start with Mr. Taylor, and then we'll go to the Bingham family.
I was curious how the Miami Herald presented this series. Took place over 2 or 3 years. Did they aggregate these smaller profiles and then put them in a big block? Did they push stories through the paper as you finished them? Did they promote them? Were they always on the front page? Did they have a logo?
All of the above. We, in the months immediately prior to publication, we dribbled out a handful of stories, usually for cause. If there was a breaking child death that we felt compelled to write about, we would write about it, and we would go full bore. Upon publication, we did something very unusual for the Miami Herald. The first installment of the series was published as a 16-page special section within which the rest of the newspaper was wrapped. So that Sunday, the front page was our front page of the series, and the inside of the newspaper was inserted in this 16-page special section. But also that day, we rolled out the online package, which included a very robust, I hate that word, but it works here, database which contained detailed profiles of 477 children, pictures where we had them, documents that we obtained that we thought our readers would want, police reports, death reviews, everything, autopsies. We made the records directly available to our readers, and we rolled out 3 videos that Emily had put together that, again, I have to pitch for her. They're tremendous. So we did the whole multimedia thing. We had a special section. We had a very, very serious online package. And that first week, we published 3 more times, like Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday. We had 3 or 4 additional stories. And we continued to hammer this thing pretty much throughout the year. One of the things we did as the year went on was we discovered that the Department of Children and Families responded to our efforts by covering up their mistakes. And what followed was several months worth of stories about how just tremendous just shenanigans. They were documents that we had been receiving for a year that were largely untouched and pristine, we were getting now redacted fully. And we had one story that was tremendously effective. Lawmakers were waving it in the Senate chamber the day we published it. We got an incident report on a death, which we already had. We did this on purpose. We have an editor who's much smarter than me and said, try this. We got an incident report, and they redacted 4/5 of it. It was almost entirely black. And we looked at the copy we had gotten from them 3 months earlier, and it had like 3 words redacted. And we took up the entire first half of the front page with a before and after picture. And lawmakers were howling. They were like, you know, we're trying to change state law to improve this, and you are covering your tracks.
No, this was their idea of transparency. The other thing that we did prior to the story is we began the week before, we would send out tweets, and each one of them was a profile of one of the children, you know, sort of leading up to it. So there were probably 24 that had come out, and all of these, you know, each was a profile with a picture. Each of them in some way was, we knew what thematically was going to, you know, we were going to be addressing in the series. And so it was, you know, we tried to do it to build up sort of the anticipation from our readers that this was coming on that Sunday, March 16th, when we rolled it out.
Inside the paper as well as the tweets?
The tweet, no, just online. That's the only way. We did it online, and then on the 16th, the outside cover of the Herald was 87 pictures of the babies, all dead children.
The tweets tweeted back to these sort of mini profiles that we used as left and right rails in the special section.
And did those require, just one other follow-up, did those require any follows-up? And if so, did you do them, or did the staff take on any things that might have rolled out from the short profiles of the case study? You know, there must have been, you print something that's pretty outrageous, must be some kind of after effect or follow-up, or somebody's going to give you more information about that particular case, or I don't know.
Well, we
They
wrote
just-
probably 24 stories after publication of all, you know, related to the series, individual cases, you know, all the movement within the legislature, the overhaul of the bill, all of that. And then we did have, and we continue to have cases where, an individual case where we still have another death, it's still considered abuse and neglect that we write about it on an individual basis. Carol mostly does.
Do all the follow-up yourself?
Yes.
Yeah.
We had, just quickly, within that year, 3 or 4 horrific cases. The worst single loss of life in Florida history occurred in Bell, Florida, within 3 or 4 months of our publication, in which a grandfather slaughtered his daughter's entire family, 6 children, his daughter, and
The
Spirit family. And we wrote extensively about all of those throughout the year.
And in that case, just like which we have been saying over and over, there were 18 phone calls to the Department of Children and Families that had in many ways warned that something was going to happen here.
I was interested in the political impact of your piece. I mean, it was such a great example of the impact of budget cuts, that Rick Scott cut $20 million out of the Child Services Department, if it were approximately
About
that
100.
much. About 100. And that caused hundreds of deaths. I mean, it's just literally, you were connecting those dots. So I'm wondering, so I wanted to know about that and budget and whether that came up politically, whether, Scott in any way took some responsibility, whether it had any political, I mean, I know you had the state legislature overhauling, of course, but did you get more, was it funded, with more money ultimately?
Yes. The first year reform legislation contained $40 or $50 million in new money, but all of that was set aside for upgrades to the investigative side, the very front end, where child abuse investigators go into homes and do their job. This year, year two, the current budget contains another $80 million for back-end services such as drug treatment, mental health care, better case management, domestic violence intervention. As a point about child welfare and social services in Florida, there appears to be, and these guys will tell you it's true, there's no downside to killing children. There isn't. The woeful, systemic, profound neglect of child welfare, social services as a whole has been utterly bipartisan in Florida. It has sustained itself for generations, and it will not change because there has been no demand from taxpayers, constituents, and advocates that they do better. And until you put these guys' feet to the fire, they'll continue to underfund and neglect.
Just a quick follow-up. You all did something which I haven't heard of much, which is you had a town hall meeting. Could you talk about that? And did you ever, were you ever accused of becoming advocates by having an event like that and sort of breaching your journalism, remove?
No, we had let me back up. One of the interesting things that happened is, we had sued 4 different times to get these state records, and, we had interviewed the interim DCF secretary several times, and, they knew that this was coming. They had responded to it, and the Friday before the story was published, they sent out a press release and noted that we were all partners in this project, and they were so pleased that we were going to shine the spotlight on this horrible problem in Florida, which has been, we've had a very interesting relationship with DCF. We actually invited them to this town hall, and they sent a representative, and frankly, they did not, for the most part, they did not challenge any of the findings at all. And, the beauty's sort of not the right word, but the beauty of this was that we were using their records to tell this story. There was no way, around that. And they did not. Even the DCF secretary, the famous quote was, we're not broken, we're challenged. So I think the results were just, there was no denying it, I guess is what I would say. And so we did have this town hall, and we had a couple of hundred people. It included people who were in the story. It did include, I would imagine, child advocates, people who were interested in this. And it also included people who were part of the child welfare system, who actually spoke on the panel and talked about, sort of the intricacies of child welfare.
There were 4 judges sitting in the front row, 2 of whom spoke. And if you're a child welfare administrator, it's hard to dispute something when the people who are on the front lines, judges, are saying, this is on you, fix it.
Miguel.
Hi, I'm Miguel Paz from Chile. I wanted to ask you, both of the teams, about craft, for example, in your case, how was the process to collaborate in the writing, in the back and forth? How do you organize your work on that? And the other team from Chicago Tribune, how do you organize such a massive amount of data and the different parts of the research, so when you would be writing, you wouldn't miss out on key factors and leave things that were really important out?
I just let him do all the work and I take all the credit.
Usually
That's my
happens.
specialty.
I just wanted to verify.
Go ahead.
Well, I, again, so David had done so much sort of establishing reporting before I sort of even came into the mix on this. So, David was very well sourced. I was sort of coming into it, blind. I had basically been, just, reading his work that led to indictments, and we were sort of getting our ducks in a row, as far as how we could set about, analyzing the results of the actual system. So there was a lot of give and take. I had to be gotten up to speed. I think one of the first things we worked on was, looking through the Redflex contract, and actually also IBM's contract with the city to get a better understanding of a scope of, what these companies were even required to hold on to for the city. So I think that was step one. And David.
Yeah, we had there were several databases we had to meld. We had a ticket database, and then we had an appeals database, and then successful appeals on top of that. And so Alex there was a lot of give and take about what things mean. This can't be right. A lot of going back to the city, going, could this possibly be? And so, I mean, we tried to engage, at least with the data, we tried to engage the city at every step of the way, because we knew where we were headed, and if there was, it's one of those, you could put the E in the wrong place and the story's wrong, right? So we had to, everything had to be right, and so we were very, very diligent working with the city on the data, especially the data part of it.
When you guys sat down to write, how did that work out? Alex, when it came to those paragraphs in the story that were very number or analysis driven, did you write that? Did you kick it to Dave? How did you guys go back and forth when it came to writing about the analyses that you did?
I don't know. I mean, the way that these stories came together, my role at the Tribune had always been more like playing an editor, right? Like when it came to, data integrity and crafting sentences that, meant exactly what we wanted them to, and described everything, as well as we thought we could, that always felt to me in a way, obviously with, Jim as well, but, the buck sort of always stopped with me there.
I would write a sentence using his data as sharply as I could, and he would come to me and say, no.
There's no way we can say that. Cannot be done. It cannot go in newspaper.
And then we would go back to the drawing board, and then Jim Webb, our editor, would step in and separate us and send us to our opposite corners.
Well, we were sort of like the odd couple. Carol is really, really organized, and she's very protective of her files, and I am very haphazard, and I can never find anything. I never know where my notebook is. I never know where my phone is, my glasses. Steve, do you have my glasses? Because I never know where anything is. But one of the things we did, and I really learned some of the organizational stuff, because she was very clear about there was so much data that you couldn't afford to operate the way that I typically do. And so what we did was we separated thematically. So snake was by itself, but then we would say, drug cases, and then we'd list all the children, the kids, the deaths that made sense in there, and then we did prescription drugs, and then we did paramours, which is Florida's genteel way of boyfriend or girlfriend, those deaths. And so we organized it thematically, and then we take each one of those, let's say we had 12 or 15 cases, we would drill down on those cases and pull additional documents, the autopsies, the medical examiner reports, start doing early interviews, almost auditioning these to see if they were going to be the appropriate cases. And then, once we got it down to a manageable number, then we would go out, we'd split it up and, go out and start doing the interviews. I personally recorded my interviews in my phone, though I could not find the phone. I would do that, and then I was so unorganized that sometimes I would just write there, in the car, start taking notes because it was the only way I would be able to remember, sort of the most powerful stuff. Because, when you're with a family, one of the lessons that I knew already, but it was certainly, it certainly became super important, was that when we were interviewing these families, being very still, because you were asking them to discuss dead children, their losses, as well as, in some cases, how those children died at the hands of a relative. And so that was one of the things that I had to learn very quickly was, I'm very animated, is to make myself as still and small as possible. And then one of the other things that I would try to do is, if it was possible and it was appropriate, ask them for a photo album. And what I found is that that was a useful vehicle to get them to talk about the children when they were alive, and things that would help you sort of fill in the details about what made them special. And then silence after that, because at the end of that, that was a very difficult process for them and myself also. And then, so what I found is that once you have that kind of an interview, write it immediately, and then you can go back and tweak it and decide where you want to move it, but I had to do it right then and there, and I think Carol did a lot of that also with her interviews.
When you guys were deciding what anecdotes to use, were you looking for cases? I mean, any death of a child is a horrific thing. Were you looking for the most outrageous cases, or were you looking for cases that went to illustrate a specific breakdown within the system, or both, or you
The latter.
The latter. Okay.
And it answers this question, but I want to give some practical advice for the journalists in the room. And one thing that we did that I highly recommend is start organizing your work immediately. The thing that you'll see online that is our database began as originally a Caspio data entry system that then became a simple Google spreadsheet. And the last field of that spreadsheet is a comments field in which we allowed ourselves to write freewheeling comments that we would look at later. The spreadsheet was broken down largely thematically, so that when you're looking at a death review, if you see domestic violence in the history of that family, you check the box. If you see allegations of drug abuse or prescription drug abuse, you check the boxes. Does the family have a criminal history? Check the box. And you have to be willing to go back and tweak your data entry system regularly, because the more cases you enter, the more you see patterns. The patterns don't emerge on day one, they emerge over time. And our original data entry system and a separate outline that we kept alongside it were the cheat sheets that we used later when determining which cases to use to illustrate the stories. And yes, to a certain degree, you're looking for cases in which the details are outlandish because you want to keep your readers. And one way to keep your readers is to tell great stories. But more than that, you're looking for cases that illustrate your points. One issue we found, and actually very late in the process, it wasn't until 8 months before publication that this particular pattern emerged. There was a methadone treatment clinic in Tampa Bay that was supplying methadone to pregnant women to help wean them off of what were considered more dangerous drugs, such as OxyContin. And the women were supposed to stick just on the methadone, mothers, but they weren't. They were abusing other drugs. They were going right back to the oxy. They were getting cocaine. And there was this horrible cluster of deaths in Tampa Bay in which the mother was a patient of this particular methadone clinic. We wrote a story about it, and then we killed the story and we folded it into a much bigger story. But that was a case where we made an effort to remain nimble as we continued our reporting, and we changed direction. We found this fascinating little cluster very late in the game, and we used it. And we had something like 20 cases, but we only wrote about a couple of them in that story, and we picked the cases that that really knocked your socks off. You know, a mother with 15 different allegations of drug abuse who ends up taking methadone while she's got little babies and, you know, kills one of them.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. Anyone? Oh, I have one more question. It's actually for you guys. I wonder, you know, one.
Not going to answer.
One thing that I don't think we've talked about here about your story is that and there's a broader context to the story that I was hoping you could talk about. The red light camera started, as you've said, under Mayor Daley, but sort of seems to have gained some steam under Emanuel, and then he's also expanding it to speed cameras. Can you talk a little bit about the financial situation that Chicago finds it in, and whether or not you feel that was sort of an underlying current, it seemed like, in your story, that these guys are on the hunt for some revenue. They're hurting on a bunch of different levels. Did that play into it at all? I'm talking about the $500 million, and if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, the underlying theme of when you look at all of our stories that sort of snowballed over 3 years is that they essentially plugged the citizenry of Chicago into a cash machine and walked away. They weren't doing what they were saying they were doing. It was clearly about profits over safety. They haven't monitored the safety. They don't know. The claims that they make about safety are just that, claims. They don't have anything to back them up. And so, I mean, and it was clear in our stories and from all the commentary we got that, I mean, that it was essentially a revenue generating thing, and it started under the previous mayor. And when we started writing about the corruption that was underlying that even more, I mean, the guy who was in City Hall at the time who started this program was very, very highly politically connected. He's on a first-name basis with Mayor Daley. He's on a first-name basis with the most powerful politician in the state, the Speaker of the House, Mike Madigan. And came up through a patronage system that has been under fire in Illinois for years. And so the political undercurrent of this, to me, has been the most fascinating part of it. I mean, how the citizenry that was literally angry and furious over these stories. I mean, I never gotten so much feedback on a story I've ever done, and yet, you know, the political state the way it is in Chicago, I mean, the bottom line is Mayor Emanuel maybe had to spend a few more $1 million to get himself reelected because of it, but everything, not other than that, not much has changed.
Sweet home Chicago. All right. So that's our program. Thank you all so much. Good job.